Hey everybody, Professor Dust here. Today we're going to talk about abusive supervision. This is the dark side of leadership. We'll talk about its definition. We'll put together a conceptual model of how abusive supervision is situated in terms of its antecedents, consequences, and then we'll also talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of abusive supervision as a theory. So let's jump right into the definition. It is the subordinate's perceptions, right? So it's the perception. It's all in the eyes of the beholder of whoever the supervisor is supervising, of the extent to which, so it's not either or, it's not that they are or they are not, it's the extent to which their supervisors engage in the sustained display, right? So it's not one time, it's consistent over time engaging in some degree of abuse. And this abuse is hostile verbal, right? So said out loud, or nonverbal behavior. And note that it does not, and this is on purpose, specifically talk about physical behavior. That's a whole other topic. For example, hitting, pushing, something like that, that's something else altogether. Abusive supervision also isn't sexual harassment and discrimination per se. Now, some of those behaviors might overlap, but abusive supervision really is this hostile verbal and nonverbal behavior. That's the focus there. So these are the 15 items, right? If you were to fill out a scale or a questionnaire on the extent to which your supervisor or direct manager or leader were abusive, these are the items that you'd probably see. And there'd be a scale that would say, rate the extent to which you agree with these specific items about your supervisor. It might also alternatively ask you to rate the amount or how often the individual engages in these specific types of behavior. And perhaps it grounds it within that day, that 6 months, or over the entire period of time that you've known them, right? So that might change in terms of the stem that you're going to be answering these questions. So things like, they ridicule me, they tell me my thoughts or feelings are stupid, they give me the silent treatment, which is an example of the nonverbals that we were talking about, puts me down in front of others, invades my privacy, reminds me of past mistakes and failures, doesn't give me credit, blames me to save himself, right? So throwing me under the bus, breaks promises, expresses anger at me when he or she's mad for another reason, makes negative comments, is rude, doesn't allow me to interact with coworkers, or tells me I'm incompetent, or lies to me, right? All of these are abusive supervision behaviors. They don't necessarily have to do all of them, right? But these are the gestalt of this abusive supervision construct, right? So somebody's going to be rating the degree to which they think they engage in all of these different behaviors, and that then becomes the extent to which they're engaging in this abusive supervision. So where did this come from? I thought it was actually a fun story. When I was a PhD student at the LeBeau College of Business in Drexel, in Philadelphia, we hosted brown bag sessions, and we would have scholars from all over the world come and give a presentation. We'd take them out to breakfast and lunch and dinner, and they would kind of mentor some of the PhD students. And I was lucky enough to have breakfast with Tepper Bennett, who is a professor now at Ohio State University. And over breakfast, somebody just casually asked him the question, how did you come up with this idea of abusive supervision? And he's really kind of the founder of that theory and has been writing about it for probably 10, 20 years now. And he said he was actually watching this movie. It's an old movie called Glenn Ross. And it's about a sales team that is underperforming, and Alec Baldwin comes in to kind of clean house. And if you've ever heard this phrase, coffee is for closers, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to do it here, but I would encourage you to go look at it. It's both entertaining and also kind of scary all at the same time. And this is actually where he got this idea of abusive supervision from. So give a Google search to Glenn Ross speech, and it should come up, and you'll know what I'm talking about. So what exactly does abusive supervision look like in terms of its conceptual model? So we have here abusive supervision situated as the independent variable. And we'll give some examples of some popular dependent variables. What is that final outcome based upon abusive supervision? And then why is it happening? What is this psychological mechanism that helps explain why abusive supervision leads to these dependent variables? And then the moderating variable, this is a variable that changes the nature of the relationship. It might enhance it, it might diminish it, it might mitigate it altogether. And so let me give you a few examples. Some of the most popular outcomes that we talk about in abusive supervision literature: abusive supervision is positively related to employee deviance, right? So they're doing things they're not supposed to do. It's also positively related to employee withdrawal. So they're just kind of shirking, they're not doing what they're supposed to doing. It's also positively related to employee turnover intentions, the likelihood that someone is considering moving on to something different. And then abusive supervision also is negatively related to employee performance. And so all of these mediating mechanisms that help explain why abusive supervision is related to these dependent variables is a little bit different. But by far the most popular within all of the research that we've seen so far is one of two things. It is a sense of justice. This should actually be negative. So abusive supervision is negatively related to this sense of justice, fairness, and justice can be broken down into different components: interpersonal components, interactional components, procedural justice, right? The procedure in which somebody's receiving some type of reward or not receiving some type of reward, and then distributive justice. Did they get what they deserve in and of itself? And so that is a very popular mediating mechanism that helps explain this relationship, as is stress. So abusive supervision is positively related to feeling more emotionally exhausted, more drained, just like you can't handle it type of feeling, right? That's what stress is all about. There's too much demand for the resources that you have, the psychological resources that you have available. And then some of the most popular moderating variables are, number one, employee conscientiousness, right? So employees that are more conscientious, they might be able to put this abusive supervision kind of in perspective, and they can handle it, and they're not fazed as much about abusive supervision. Doesn't mean it goes away, doesn't mean they don't care, but they have a higher likelihood of being able to handle their supervisor being abusive, and it doesn't necessarily lead to the same degree of that mediating variable, and in turn that dependent variable. Something that can enhance the relationship between abusive supervision and these dependent variables or mediating variables is this idea of a hostile climate, right? So employee conscientiousness is really what's going on within the mind and behaviors of the employee. But hostile climate is the social setting in which the abusive supervisor and the employee is embedded. So if you're embedded in a hostile climate and your supervisor is being abusive, you're likely to have a stronger reaction to that abusive supervision, right? So it might depend on you, might depend on your environment, or a host of other different moderating variables that change the effect size, so to speak, of the abusive supervision to outcome relationship. And these are just examples. There's plenty more out there, but this is a good starting point. So why would a supervisor engage in abuse? Well, there's three theoretical perspectives that have been put forth and evaluated in empirical research. The first one is an actor-focused framework that essentially says, well, the actor, the abuser, just has some specific characteristic. It could be that they're Machiavellian, it could be that they're narcissistic, it could be that they are neurotic, some negative or dark triad type trait that makes that individual have a higher likelihood of engaging in that type of behavior. There's also been some research in things like motives. One good example of motives would be what's called bottom line mentality. This is when the individual feels that it is appropriate to engage in whatever behaviors are necessary in order to meet the bottom line, right? So profitability and revenue is more important than anything else, regardless of the means through which you get to that end. Another perspective is what's called victimization. A good example of this is when the employee is a subpar performer. Research would suggest there's a stronger likelihood that that supervisor will engage in some degree of abusive supervision, right? So there is a rationale for why that person wants to engage in abuse. It's because they feel as if they need to, or they are warranted in doing so because that person deserves it. The third one is this trickle-down perspective, and this is simply this trickle-down from one part of the hierarchy down to the next level, right? So there is some degree of role modeling. I, as a supervisor, have a higher likelihood of engaging in abusive supervision if my superior does the same thing. They are role modeling that, hey, this is acceptable behavior around here. This is how you could move up in this organization. This is the behavior I expect. So it makes me more likely to engage in that behavior as well. Some of the strengths of this theory, it really gets at the dark side of leadership. Interestingly, for a long period of time, there has only been studies of the good side of leadership, the bright side of leadership. But arguably, preventing bad leadership is just as important, if not more important, than promoting good leadership. A lot of time, people want to do good things and they want to do good by their employees. So, maybe they're a 3 or a 4 out of 5 when it comes to their bright side leadership skills, abilities, behaviors. But what's the value in incrementally moving that person from a 3 to a 4 or a 4 to a 5? Arguably, if you have a bunch of 5s on abusive supervision and you could take them down to a 4, or you can just delete them altogether from your organization, that's going to be a heck of a lot more effective in terms of organizational effectiveness and organizational outcomes, right? So this is kind of flipping on its head the fact that we're only focusing on the good of leadership. We should also be focusing on the bad. And another strength of this abusive supervision literature is that there's a robust theoretical model, right? I showed you this conceptual model and a few examples of mediating variables, moderating variables, dependent variables. It's very well explained, and it's pretty clear what's called nomological network looks like. And there's also lots of research and plentiful empirical support for all stages of that conceptual model, as well as these mentalities or frameworks that help describe why abusive supervision is taking place. In terms of criticisms, there's been a lot of discussion about this potential for a bright side of abusive supervision. And arguably, it's possible that if you really just need somebody to get something done quickly in the short term because they have to produce and you need it now, you can engage in some degree of abusive supervision and get it done in the short term. So interestingly, there hasn't been a lot of work that's really paid attention to the fact that you might be able to get this short-term boost in the performance that you need from your employees if perhaps you only engage in the abusive supervision approach one time or only when you really need it, which is a little bit scary, but it is relatively real. Findings typically driven by outliers is another criticism. So abusive supervision, interestingly, has what's called a relatively low base rate phenomenon. If you were to look at all the hundreds, maybe even thousands by now studies that evaluate abusive supervision and pinpoint the mean for that entire sample, right, all the people that were sampled within that study, you'll find that the mean for abusive supervision is somewhere in the low to low moderate range. What that means, if they're finding some type of results about the fact that abusive supervision is positively correlated, for example, with these negative outcomes, what that means is that the findings, for the most part, are being driven by some degree of outliers. And so we have to evaluate our data in context. From a practical perspective, you could argue that we really don't need to be focusing on trying to mitigate abusive supervision for all of the employees that we have in our organization. What we should be doing is just trying to screen out those that will be the high abusive supervisors, not those that are on moderate or those that are on low and might become moderate. Really, the big bang for the buck is getting rid of the abusive supervisors that are already high. Lack of prescriptive insight on managing abusive supervision. That's the last criticism. We really don't know what to do with these managers, supervisors, leaders, etc. when they are engaging in abuse. There's really not a good framework from a prescriptive standpoint to illustrate for organizations what should be done. And again, descriptive is just helping understand what it is. Prescriptive is more about what to do with it. So what? Right, so we know that we know that abusive supervision is bad, and we know all the reasons why. But okay, what do we do with it? Can you actually fix it? Is this something that can be trained away? Is this something that we should just, is it more efficient to just get rid of them altogether? There's not a lot of prescriptive insight in terms of what now for abusive supervision. All right, so that wraps up everything about abusive supervision for now. Good luck out there.